Hello and welcome to Freedom Watch, your daily dose of raw liberty. Streaming online at foxnews.com, I'm your host, Judge Andrew Napolitano, here defending freedom, defending your natural rights, and defending your right to have a government that stays within the confines of the Constitution. The public school system has taught our children that President Herbert Hoover's middle name was laissez-faire, a champion of small government. But in fact, President Hoover was not a champion of small government. Quite the contrary. Hoover was elected in 1928. He became president in March 1929, and the market crashed just 6 months later. President Hoover actually made the Depression worse by doing some of the same things the current government is doing. He enacted ruinous tariffs. He gave away cash. He created regulatory authorities, the type of stuff history conveniently and often overlooks. So why is it that history overlooks the real Herbert Hoover? And what did the real Herbert Hoover did? To examine those questions, what we can learn from his presidency, and how it compares to that of President Obama, we're joined by Robert Higgs, Senior Fellow in Political Economy for the Independent Institute and editor of the Institute's quarterly journal, The Independent Review. Bob, welcome to Freedom Watch.
Thank you very much.
So, what did Herbert Hoover do when the stock market crashed? And why is it that almost every school child, and you and I were once school children, were raised to think he did nothing?
Well, first of all, I think it's important to realize that the way Hoover's reputation has come down to us has been shaped by Roosevelt idolaters, and they have had an interest in portraying Roosevelt in the best possible light and in a very partisan way in relation to Hoover. So just as they needed to deify FDR, they needed to demonize Hoover, and so history has been written very much in that way. But as you said, Hoover was certainly no conservative. In fact, he was a very important progressive. It was not by accident that he held a high position in Woodrow Wilson's government during World War I as head of the War Food Administration. And he had worked very hard as Secretary of Commerce in the 1920s to inject the government into government business relations in a great variety of ways. So Hoover was an activist. He was a progressive. He was one who believed that government ought to play an expanded role in economic life.
And in those days, we're talking about his role in the Wilson administration in the teens, and then his role in the 20s, and then, of course, his presidency in the late 20s and early 30s. The idea, correct me if I'm wrong, Bob Higgs, of the federal government in your face, or of the federal government between you and your employee, or you and your employer, or you and the person or company with whom you're entering into a contract. This was a radical idea. This was the type of big government, muscular federal government that the people had never experienced before, and the Constitution in no way countenanced.
Well, it was new in many respects, particularly in the way it was put into practice, but we have to recognize that it was an idea that goes back at least to the turn of the century, and in the early part of the 20th century, many leaders of big business began to think that it was in their interest to develop institutional ways in which they could, as it were, join forces with the government and actually control it in the interests of their own objectives. So we can see these operations going on in the background of politics from the very beginning of the 20th century, but Hoover certainly did give them wider scope during his time as Secretary of Commerce, and he was a great believer in what he called business-government cooperation. And I think people need to understand that whenever they hear about business-government cooperation or business-labor-government cooperation, what they're actually looking at is what was frankly called in the 1930s in Italy fascism.
Absolutely. Private ownership and government control. Gee,
Yes.
Bob, Doesn't that sound a little familiar now? Hasn't the president and hasn't his Secretary of the Treasury said, we want to look at contracts before the banks enter into them because we'll decide if those contracts might adversely affect liquidity, and we want to look into the salaries that executives are earning because we'll decide if the bank is misspending its depositors' money? Don't these people learn from history, Bob Higgs?
Well, they do learn, but what they learn is that by using the power of government, they can feather their own nest. And so they never really give up on that attempt or mission. And, of course, the big businesses have tended to be much more successful because they have a lot more money to throw around and influence politicians. So there has tended to develop, for a long time in this country, a kind of cozy kind of crony capitalism at the highest levels, and we're seeing a great deal of it recently with the way the government has bailed out, particularly the biggest players in the financial industries, rather than the small fry. You know, there are thousands of banks in this country, most of which have been soundly managed, and we're in okay shape a year ago or a year and a half ago, but the people at the top of the financial heap, the Bank of America, the Goldman Sachs, these people had got themselves involved in a lot of bad bets, and when those bets could no longer be concealed from being bad and their values began to go south, they immediately turned to their friends in high places in the government, and particularly in the Treasury Department and the Fed.
Right. I think most people watching and listening to us now recognize your face and your name and your voice. You are the leading intellectual in the country on the growth of the government in the past 100 years, and your book, Crisis and Leviathan, is the standard against which all others are to be measured in calculating, in measuring, and in documenting the unprecedented growth, both economically and in terms of seizing power of the government in the past century. In that book, I want to focus in just on two things. One is just sort of what I would think is a historical inversion. When FDR, who was then the governor of New York, ran against President Herbert Hoover in the campaign of 1932, FDR was the guy who defended the free market and attacked Herbert Hoover for interfering with the economy. Of course, FDR would become president and would bring us closest to fascism and in some respects closer to socialism than we ever have at any other time. Yet, as you say, those who love FDR and the New Deal and the big government he brought us, which are still here today, make it look as if Hoover was the bad guy and FDR was the good guy. But one of the things that Hoover did, and here's what I want you to focus in on, Bob, was the concept of tariffs. What was the effect on the cost of thousands of items, many of which were household items that many middle-class Americans had to use and purchase on a regular basis? What was the cost to the price of those things as a result of President Hoover's tariffs? Well,
tariffs are taxes on imported goods, and so, of course, the effect of taxing anything is to make it more expensive. The Smoot-Hawley tariff that was signed by Hoover in the middle of 1930 and had been under discussion in the Congress for a year or more caused the prices of some 20,000 goods, many of them ordinary goods people consumed regularly, to be affected, and that is to say, to be increased. That tariff raised tariff levels to the highest level they had ever reached, even though this was a high tariff country in the late 19th century.
And is it true to say, Bob, that this ignited a tariff war, that in terms it became more expensive to purchase goods that were imported, and it diminished our ability to export goods because other countries imposed a tariff on us?
Oh, absolutely. The Smoot-Hawley tariff, even before it was finally approved by the Congress and signed by the President, led a number of countries to take retaliatory action. And after it took effect in mid-1930, a number of other countries retaliated as well. So the effect was that countries began to adopt what are sometimes called beggar thy neighbor tariff policies, restricting the inflow of imports by making them more expensive, and seemingly helping their own producers, but at the same time impoverishing their people all around. And the volume of world trade fell by more than 50% in the early 1930s, and world trade was one of the prime means by which the world's standard of living had been raised during the previous century.
And of course, we know that President Obama just imposed tariffs on automobile tires coming from China, and the Chinese retaliated by imposing tariffs on poultry products coming from the United States. The book is Crisis and Leviathan. My guest is Bob Higgs from the Independent Institute. Bob, it's a pleasure. Thanks for joining us on Freedom Watch.
Well, thank you very much for having me, Judge.